Caroline Dowd-Higgins. Thank you for listening to Your Working Life, my podcast series featuring thought leaders in the career and personal growth arena. You spend a significant portion of your life at work, so my goal is to provide you with tools, inspiration, and resources so you can enjoy your career and love your life. And I am delighted to welcome my very special guest to the show today, Stephen Koltai. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, let me tell the listening audience all about you, Stephen, and then we're going to talk about this amazing new book. Stephen Koltai is a guest scholar at the Brookings Institute and managing director of entrepreneurship consultancy Koltai and Company, LLC. He's a successful repeat entrepreneur in the telecommunications and event management industries, and from 2009 to 11 served as senior advisor for entrepreneurship in Secretary Hillary Clinton's State Department. So, Stephen, really exciting. Your new book is called Peace Through Entrepreneurship, Investing in a Startup Culture for Security and Development. So I have to ask right off the bat, what prompted you to write this particular book?
Well, what prompted me to write this particular book, having written it, is probably going to be the only particular book I ever write, because it was so much work. I am primarily a business guy. Most of my background has been in media and entertainment business, as you mentioned. Had several startups. I was at Warner Brothers for a decade as head of strategy and head of the operating committee, and I started a television satellite company in Europe in the mid-'80s, which was how I got into this whole space. And everything I've done, I have grown and grown in respect for entrepreneurs, of which, by the way, Caroline, I would consider you to be a prime example, because entrepreneurs, I define an entrepreneur as somebody who has the vision to conceive of a new product or process and the ability to then make it happen.
Yeah.
And when you look at the people who shake things up and who actually make things happen, including, in my view, most important of all, creating jobs.
Yeah.
It is entrepreneurs. And I have a background in international affairs. I was born in Budapest to parents who were Holocaust survivors. We left Hungary after the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, which was the only major armed uprising against the Soviet Empire. So I have a background that gives me a personal sense of what happens when sort of things go very badly, when things go really wrong, and when, the whole sort of civilized order collapses. And in my opinion, the single biggest reason that happens is joblessness. It's when people have no hope of ever being able to be independent or support themselves. And if you look around the world, that is when the worst things happen. And I observed this particularly with respect to the Middle East when I worked at the State Department. My program there, the Global Entrepreneurship Program, was about job creation in mostly Arab countries, which, by the way, not coincidentally, have the highest rate of youth unemployment of any region in the world. And I believe there's a strong connection between unemployment and political unrest, instability, and violence. And so that's why I do this work, and that's why I wrote this book.
Thank you for connecting the dots so eloquently. That is really extraordinary and paints a very clear picture for me now about the why. I have to say, though, it is an ambitious title, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I'm an ambitious person. Do you really believe that entrepreneurship is the key to world peace? I appreciate your concept of sustainability for the individual and how that impacts how they play a role as a citizen of the world and their particular community. But let's talk about world peace.
Right. Well, this is been kind of a running joke for a long time. I had some friends who worked with me at the State Department who, to make fun of me, spelled it world, WHIRLED, peace, PEAS, as in world peas.
Got it.
But the fact of the matter is, Caroline, that obviously there are a million and one things that contribute to violence and the breakdown of civil order. All sorts of things, from disease, crime, hunger, climate change, struggles for water. I mean, there are a million and one things. Cultural differences, political differences. Most of these things, I at least as an individual, don't have the ability to affect. But in line with the famous Serenity Prayer, grant me the ability to change the things I can. One of the few things that we actually are very good at, and particularly Americans, is entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
In fact, in my research, I learned that even among the people around the world who hate us the most, which unfortunately is a large number of people, even those respect America's entrepreneurial know-how almost universally. And so what I have found is that obviously there's, peace is a complicated thing to achieve and requires a lot of oars in the water. But one of the things that's actually influenceable is job creation.
Yeah.
And the single biggest way to create jobs, in our own country, by the way, this has been true, all of the net job creation in the U.S. since 1985, according to the Kauffman Foundation of Kansas City, which is the largest funder of entrepreneurship research, has been in small and medium-sized businesses. Large companies have had a net decrease in their payrolls. So in America, we know and we love entrepreneurs. This is not true in much of the world, and it's something we have to offer.
And it's interesting because as a career coach and someone who's out there on the front lines with individuals, I can tell you that entrepreneurial ventures are on the rise. We talk about this new gig economy, and even people that might have that quintessential day job perhaps are dabbling on the side with some kind of entrepreneurial venture. So it seems to be at a tipping point where more people are taking that entrepreneurial leap.
Right. Well, I think you've also put your finger on another really important point, which is what you're describing is what I call entrepreneurs are the rock stars of today mentality in the United States. This is not true all over the world. This is very American. And actually, this respect for, enthusiasm for, support by your friends and family for people who try and do something entrepreneurial, that is quite uniquely American, and it is very much missing in a lot of places around the world, which, as far as I'm concerned, somebody who sort of sees the glass as half full, I see that as an opportunity for Americans of all kinds to spread some of that culture of entrepreneurship around the world, and, by the way, deal with what I consider to be the single biggest reason for crisis in the world.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clearly. It's interesting, this whole concept of crowdfunding, crowdsourcing,
right,
to really kickstart Indiegogo, you name it. There are so many platforms where you literally ask your friends and neighbors and families to give you something small to help you get this venture off the ground. So do you think that has exponential potential globally?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a two-way street, by the way. I think that it is, it has, there's an enormous need for it abroad, but I also think there's an enormous opportunity for Americans who come from a place where there's a lot more support and energy around entrepreneurship. And by the way, Americans tend to be from everywhere in the world. So there are Americans who speak every language, who know every country. So if you look at the opportunity for not only starting new businesses, but helping others start new businesses, we have a unique spot, a unique role for that.
Now, let me ask, Stephen, because you do argue in the book that the U.S. government does not enough in terms of helping entrepreneurs in unstable countries. So what can we, as a U.S. entity, the government specifically, what can we do to bolster entrepreneurship in developing countries, for example?
Right. Well, you're exactly right. I mean, I wrote the book, there are really two parts to the book, and there are two main points of the book. The first is to argue why entrepreneurship is so important, and there's a chapter called A Million Reasons Entrepreneurship is Good for You. I don't want to scare anybody. I don't really have a million, but I have a baker's dozen, which is 13. So I talk about, a lot of things that you don't normally or not always think of. And then the second half of the book is, but we're not doing a very good job. And one of the things I mention is, if you take, for example, just the wars that we're in right now in Iraq and Afghanistan, by far the two most significant, U.S. military, efforts underway since we started those wars, since we invaded those countries. American taxpayers have spent over $2 trillion and over 50,000 lives.
Wow.
And in the 15 plus years. And but the underlying issue in those places, which in my mind is closely connected to the hopelessness and the desperation that especially young people feel, and 70% of the population in the Arab world, at least, is under the age of 26. The youth unemployment rates in those countries are 1.5 times what they were when we got there before we spent $2 trillion. So my argument is if we would have spent a tiny, tiny infinitesimal percentage of that on job creation programs instead of on destroying the infrastructure of those countries, we may actually have gotten more bang for the buck. We may be in a better position in terms of security at home and fear of terrorism than we are today, having spent these huge sums of money, which is why the subtitle of the book is Investing in a Startup Culture for Security and Development.
Well, and I hear you now. It's this sustainability model too, right? How do you plant those seeds, literally? And there's a gorgeous picture on the front cover of your book with that very thing to grow into the long-term investment. Stephen, I want to unpack something else. Microfinance. We were talking very briefly about in the American culture of crowdsourcing, crowdfunding. You argue that microfinancing is fine, and that's giving small loans to poor people to start businesses. But that's not what you're talking about here. So help us understand your definition of entrepreneurship.
Right. Well, that is a really important point. I want to say I do support entirely microfinance, but the distinction I make is sort of the distinction between small business versus entrepreneurial business. So, for example, if you open a new barbershop or coffee shop, that is definitely a small business. It's not necessarily, in my definition, an entrepreneurial business because there are lots of barbershops and coffee shops. If, on the other hand, you develop a new process for selling coffee like Starbucks, or you develop a new way of marketing haircuts like Supercuts, they didn't invent coffee and they didn't invent haircuts, but they changed the business model. And in doing so, they went from creating an employment opportunity for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who might work in a barbershop to thousands and thousands of people because they've now become major companies. I say in the book, more people work for Starbucks in Silicon Valley than work for Google in the whole world.
Wow. Yeah.
So one of the things that I point out is that small business is wonderful, but if the goal is job creation, it's also about entrepreneurial or scalable business. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is that it is about a new process or product, and it isn't always about tech. Very often, some of the biggest job creators, like the example I just gave, are what I call no-tech or low-tech businesses, coffee or haircuts.
Yeah.
Those are not tech businesses. In America, we tend to equate entrepreneurship with tech, but but it isn't always tech. I mean, Costco is an entrepreneurial business. Home Depot is an entrepreneurial business, and they're not about tech.
So what are your thoughts about what we call the disruptive innovators of Airbnb and Uber,
Right.
that have created jobs and sideline freelance opportunities for so many? What are your thoughts there?
Right. Well, that is so. I divide entrepreneurs into entrepreneurship into three categories: no tech, low tech, and high tech.
Okay.
So I consider Uber and Airbnb to be low tech. It means that the innovation was not technology. The innovation was the application of an existing technology to a business. In some cases, to an existing business, taxis, which is what Uber was. And in some cases, to not an existing business, which is what the sharing economy was, which is what Airbnb is about. So, but neither of them relied upon major technological breakthroughs.
Right.
Some businesses obviously do. Google, which is, was one of the companies, by the way, not the first company, to develop a new algorithm for web search. That was high tech. That was new intellectual property. But the people who are using the Google platform, millions and hundreds of millions of people who have all sorts of businesses now who rely on search, they are what I would call no tech or low tech, using an existing high tech platform.
So, Stephen, walk me through the 6+6 entrepreneurship ecosystem model that you talk about in the book. And specifically, how does this work in practice? But please fill us in first about what it is for those who have not yet read the book.
Right, absolutely. So in the work I was doing, Carolyn, I found out that there's not there's no one thing that you can do to bolster entrepreneurship. There are only a combination of things. So if you do nothing else but, for example, start an angel fund, or if you do nothing but have a business plan competition, that in and of itself is not necessarily going to bolster entrepreneurial activity in a geography. And a geography can be a city in the United States, or it can be your neighborhood, or it can be a country. But when you do multiple things and combine them together, that's when you get real progress. So I developed this notion of an ecosystem where it's not about one thing. And the ecosystem has 6 categories of activity and 6 categories of player. And it's by doing things across, knitting those together, that you get real movement, you get real progress. So the 6 categories of activity are identifying entrepreneurs, training, connecting and sustaining, funding, enabling public policy, which is regulatory, and celebrating entrepreneurs. And those 6 categories of activity have specific programs, which I'll give you an example or two of in a second. And then there are 6 categories of players who have to be involved: corporations, foundations, universities, NGOs or non-government organizations, foundations, investors, and government. And so what I do in the work that I do, and again, this can be done domestically or internationally, is I look for, first I diagnose. It's a 3-step process: diagnosis, design, and implementation. First, you diagnose an ecosystem.
Okay.
And you look at what's missing. And then in these 6 categories, and there's an example of that in the book that we did for Ghana, where we looked at the overall ecosystem of Ghana using the 6+6 model, and we found certain things that were missing. One of which, by the way, was this culture of entrepreneurship, which we talked about earlier in our conversation. And then we came up with programs that address some of the gaps. So just to give you an example, and this is a fun example. It's not expensive. It relates very much actually to the kind of work you yourself do. And it's what I call entrepreneurship journalism. And what we did is we brought a few U.S. journalists who covered startups, both in the digital media, online, social media podcasts like you,
right,
and also traditional print journalists. And we trained local journalists, who were mostly business correspondents, how to better cover startups. And the result was that they covered more startups.
Brilliant.
And the result of covering more startups was showing people in Ghana that it's not just Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page of Google who can start businesses, but there are actually people in your country, in Ghana, with all of the problems that you yourself face, lack of electricity, corruption, all of the problems you have. And even there are entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs exist everywhere. And by telling their story, you start to empower people to think, well, hey, maybe I could do this too. And that's what the 6+6 model allows us to do. It allows us to diagnose an issue and come up with several remedies.
So, Stephen, is there a country or a region that you would share as a good example of using entrepreneurship to drive economic growth in that ecosystem model?
Great question. Yes, of course. There are a couple of examples I talk about in the book. Two that are particularly fun, I think, are Singapore and Jamaica. Singapore and Jamaica in 1960 were both former British colonies. They were almost exactly the same size, 2.4 million people. They were islands, and they had identical per capita income. Today, obviously, that's very different. Singapore has one of the highest per capita incomes in the world, over $60,000 per person. Jamaica is, in real dollars, almost unchanged from what it was in 1960. The population of Singapore is two and a half times what it was, and the standard of living is incomparably higher than it was. And one of the principal things that differentiates the two, the first most important thing, is good governance. Singapore had very stable government for much of this time, not without blemishes, I want to add. The Singapore model had a lot of questions about how free it was and how truly participatory it was. But the fact of the matter is that it is one of the most successful democratic free market systems in the world. Look at how it's outpaced Jamaica. The other example I use is Rwanda post-genocide. Rwanda, 20 years ago after the genocide, was probably a country in the worst shape of any country in, modern history of man. 70% of the men between the ages of 18 and 40 were dead. The average age in the country was 12. 65% of the women were HIV infected. Wow. There were 2 medical doctors in the country. And today, Rwanda has had the fastest growth in its per capita income of any country in the history of sub-Saharan Africa. It's quadrupled its per capita income in less than 20 years. It has improved its business regulatory climate on the World Bank measures this in something called the Doing Business Report. Its World Bank Doing Business Report standing has increased more than any country of the 200 that are monitored since the World Bank started keeping records 15 or 16 years ago. And this was led primarily by a government emphasis on promoting entrepreneurship. So here are a couple of examples of countries where it has really, really worked.
Incredible. Stephen Koltai, what a joy to have you on the show. Your book is Peace Through Entrepreneurship, Investing in a Startup Culture for Security and Development, and it is truly thought-provoking. How do we buy the book, and how do we follow you in the world?
Well, the book is available on Amazon and also from the Brookings Institution Press. And you can follow me very easily. My name is Koltai, Koltai. So you can follow me on Twitter at skoltai or online at my company, which is Koltai & Co. And there are links there to a whole bunch of other social media. But if you Google my name, or the book, you will find me pretty quickly.
You will indeed. You will indeed. Stephen, what a joy. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and expertise. And I wish you continued success with this transformative book. And I hope our paths cross again.
Well, it's an honor to have been on your show, and I thank you for having me.
Thank you, Stephen. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in to Your Working Life, where my goal is to help you design your career destiny so it doesn't happen by default. Career and life satisfaction is possible, and it's time to embrace what you love doing so you can do more of it. The show is now available on iTunes, YouTube, Podbean, and Stitcher. Leave a comment because I always appreciate hearing from my listeners. I'm Caroline Dowd-Higgins. Take good care.